The mountains of the Balkans were silent that night. Cold wind moved slowly through the black forests. Fog clung to the hills like a shroud. And high above the valley stood a monastery of stone. The monastery of St. Theodora. Its walls were old. Older than many kingdoms that had risen and fallen across the land. Inside those walls lived women who had abandoned the world. Christian nuns. 40 of them. Some were daughters of noble families. Some had fled war. Some had escaped marriages they did not choose. But all had chosen the same path. Silence. Prayer. Devotion. Their days followed a rhythm older than memory. Before dawn the bell rang. Cold water washed tired faces. Candles flickered inside the chapel. Soft whispers of prayer rose toward the wooden ceiling. Outside the monastery walls the world was burning. Empires were moving like storms across the continent. The Ottoman Empire had been expanding for generations. Fortresses had fallen. Cities had been conquered. Kingdoms had vanished. But the monastery remained untouched. A small island of faith in a violent world. Or so the sisters believed. Inside the library, ancient manuscripts rested on wooden shelves. Ink drawings of saints. Pages worn by centuries of prayer. The abbess, an elderly woman named Mother Elisabetta, guarded those books like sacred relics. She had lived within the monastery for more than 40 years. She had seen armies pass through the valley before. But never had soldiers entered these walls. Monasteries were meant to be protected. Even in war. Even in conquest. Even in empire. But wars had been growing darker. Rumors had reached the monastery weeks earlier. Villages burned. Churches looted. Monks taken prisoner. Travelers arriving at the gates carried stories they could barely speak. Stories of soldiers who showed no mercy. Stories of captives taken eastward never to return. Still, the abbess told the sisters not to fear. The walls were strong. The gates were thick oak reinforced with iron. And the monastery stood far from the main roads. Hidden in the mountains. Hidden from war. But that night, the wind carried something unusual. One of the youngest nuns stood at a narrow window facing the forest. Her name was Sister Caterina. She was only 19. She had entered the monastery just 2 years earlier. At first she thought the sound was thunder. Low. Distant. Rolling across the valley. But thunder did not repeat like that. The sound came again. And again. Hoofbeats. At first only a few. Then many. Too many. Her heart began to race. She ran down the stone corridor toward the chapel. Her sandals echoed against the cold floor. The abbess looked up as Caterina burst through the door. Mother Riders. The word hung in the air. For a moment no one spoke. Then the bell began to ring. Not the morning bell. Not the prayer bell. The warning bell. Its deep sound rolled across the valley. But outside the monastery walls, the forest had already begun to glow. Torches. Dozens of them. Then hundreds. Like a river of fire moving through the trees. The Ottoman cavalry had arrived. The riders surrounded the monastery with terrifying silence. Steel helmets reflected the torchlight. Curved swords hung at their sides. Banners moved slowly in the night wind. Inside the monastery panic spread. Some nuns began praying loudly. Others wept. A few tried to bar the gate. Heavy beams were dragged across the entrance. But experienced soldiers knew how to break stone and wood. The commander of the Ottoman riders stepped forward. He studied the monastery walls carefully. He knew these places. Quiet. Sacred. Defenseless. Then he raised his hand. Torches flew through the darkness. Flames struck the wooden gate. Smoke rose into the night sky. Inside the courtyard, the sisters gathered around the abbess. Mother Elisabetta lifted a trembling hand. "Do not run," she whispered. "Stay together." But outside, the gate began to crack. Wood splintered under the force of axes. The sound echoed through the monastery like thunder. 1 strike. 2 strikes. 3. Each blow shaking the door that had protected generations of women. Sister Caterina clutched her rosary so tightly the beads cut into her skin. Prayers filled the courtyard. But the soldiers did not stop. The gate split open with a violent crack. Flames burst inward. And through the smoke, armored figures began pouring into the monastery. What followed that night would echo through history. But the worst part had not even begun yet. The broken gate lay in flames. Smoke rolled through the monastery courtyard like dark waves. And through that smoke, the soldiers came. Boots struck the stone ground with cold precision. Steel armor glimmered beneath the torchlight. Curved blades hung at their belts. The nuns huddled together near the chapel steps. Some prayed aloud. Some whispered. Some simply stared in silence. The abbess stepped forward. Mother Elisabetta was old, but her voice carried strength. She raised a trembling hand toward the soldiers. "This is a house of God," she said. For a moment the courtyard fell quiet. The Ottoman commander approached slowly. His cloak moved in the night wind. His eyes studied the frightened women before him. Not with anger. Not with mercy. Only calculation. He said nothing. Instead, he turned to his men and gave a short command. The soldiers spread through the monastery like shadows. Doors were kicked open. Cells searched. Corridors filled with echoes of boots and metal. Anything valuable was taken. Books. Silver crosses. Candlesticks from the chapel altar. But it soon became clear. They had not come only for gold. 2 soldiers grabbed the first nun from the group. She screamed as her arms were pulled behind her back. Rough rope tightened around her wrists. One by one the sisters were dragged apart. Chains appeared. Cold iron rings locked around fragile hands. The courtyard that had once held quiet prayers now held captives. Mother Elisabetta tried again. "These women have taken vows," she pleaded. "They belong only to God." The commander finally spoke. His voice was calm. But the words were merciless. "In war," he said quietly, "all things belong to the empire." The soldiers began separating the women. Younger nuns were pushed to one side. Older ones to another. No explanation was given. Only orders. Sister Caterina found herself pulled into the line of the young. Her hands trembled as iron shackles closed around her wrists. She looked across the courtyard. The abbess stood among the older women. Their eyes met. For a moment the noise faded. The abbess nodded gently. A silent message. "Be strong." Then the soldiers forced the groups apart. Some nuns cried out for their sisters. Others tried to cling to one another. But the soldiers tore them away. One of the younger nuns collapsed to her knees. "I will not go," she cried. A soldier struck her across the face. The sound echoed across the stone walls. Blood touched the ground where prayers had once been whispered. Torches burned brighter. Shadows stretched across the monastery walls like ghosts. Outside the gate horses waited. Rows of them. Prepared for a journey. That was when a terrible realization began spreading among the captives. They were not being executed. They were being taken somewhere. Somewhere far from the monastery. Somewhere far from home. Sister Katerina turned to one of the older nuns who had been forced beside the younger group. "Where are they taking us?" she whispered. The woman did not answer at first. Her face had turned pale. Finally she spoke in a voice barely louder than breath. "East." The word carried a weight none of the younger women understood. But the older ones did. For years travelers had spoken of what happened to captives taken east. Markets where prisoners were sold. Fortresses where resistance was punished. Places where names were erased. And lives were reshaped by force. The soldiers began forcing the captives toward the gate. Chains clattered against stone. The monastery courtyard slowly emptied. The chapel door stood open behind them. Candles still burned inside, flickering softly as if nothing had happened. Sister Katerina turned back for one final look. The monastery had been her world, her refuge, her promise of peace. Now it stood broken and silent behind her, as the prisoners were pushed into the darkness beyond the walls. The commander watched them carefully, because the journey ahead was long, and the fate waiting at its end was something these women could not yet imagine. For many of them, death that night in the courtyard would have been the kinder mercy. Dawn arrived slowly. Grey light crept across the mountains. Mist covered the valley like a burial cloth. The monastery was already far behind them. The prisoners walked in silence. Chains connected their wrists. Ropes bound them together in groups. Bare feet pressed against cold dirt roads and jagged stones. The Ottoman riders surrounded them from every side. Some rode ahead. Some behind. Watching. Waiting. The long march had begun. Sister Katerina stumbled as the chain jerked forward. Her legs were weak from fear and exhaustion. She had never traveled beyond the monastery valley before. Now every step carried her farther from the only home she had ever known. No one spoke loudly. The soldiers allowed no conversation. Only the sounds of movement filled the morning air. Chains rattling. Horses breathing. Boots striking the ground. Occasionally a quiet sob. The road wound through dark forests where sunlight barely reached the earth. Tall trees watched in silence. Branches creaked in the cold wind. Once they passed a burned village. Blackened wood still smoked among the ruins. A broken church bell lay in the dirt beside the road. Some of the nuns began crying again. They understood now. The war had already reached far deeper into the land than they had believed. Hours turned into days. The march never seemed to end. Food was scarce. Water was given only when the soldiers stopped. At night the prisoners were tied to wooden posts or trees. Guards watched them beneath flickering torchlight. Sleep came in short, restless moments. Every sound in the darkness felt like a threat. Every whisper of wind carried fear. On the third night, rain began to fall. Cold and relentless. The prisoners huddled together in the mud. Their habits were soaked. Their hair clung to their faces. Some began whispering prayers through trembling lips. Others had fallen into a numb silence. But among them was an older nun named Sister Magdalena. She had lived longer than most of the others. She had seen the world before entering the monastery. And she understood something the younger nuns did not. Where they were going. That night Katerina leaned close to her. "Where are they taking us?" she whispered again. Magdalena looked toward the soldiers sitting by the fire. Then she lowered her voice. "There are places along the empire's borders," she said quietly. "Fortresses where prisoners are held." Katerina felt her chest tighten. "For ransom?" she asked. Magdalena slowly shook her head. "Not always." She hesitated, as if the next words were too heavy to speak. The Empire does not simply kill prisoners who resist, she continued. They break them. The wind carried the smell of wet earth and smoke through the trees. Katerina felt the chain around her wrists grow colder. What do you mean break them? Magdalena's eyes moved slowly across the group of women. Faces pale in the firelight. Some barely conscious. Others whispering desperate prayers. There are punishments, Magdalena said softly. Punishments meant to erase who a person once was. Katerina did not understand. Not yet. But fear settled deep inside her chest. On the fourth day the forest ended. The prisoners climbed a narrow road along a steep cliff. Far below them waves crashed against black rocks. And ahead, rising above the sea, stood something that made the nuns stop in terror. A fortress. Its walls rose directly from the stone cliffs. Dark towers pierced the sky. Iron gates guarded the entrance. Flags moved slowly in the ocean wind. It looked less like a fortress, and more like a prison carved from the bones of the earth. One of the soldiers laughed as the prisoners stared upward. The gates began to open. Slowly. Heavily. As if the fortress itself were waking. Sister Magdalena whispered something under her breath. A prayer. Or perhaps a warning. Because she recognized the place. And she knew something the others did not. Very few prisoners who entered those walls ever walked out again. The iron gates closed behind them with a sound like thunder. Stone swallowed the last light of the outside world. The fortress courtyard was vast. Cold. Empty. High walls blocked the sea wind, but the air still carried the smell of salt and rusted iron. The prisoners were pushed forward. Chains clattered against the stone ground. Above them soldiers watched from the towers. Silent figures standing along the battlements. The fortress felt less like a military stronghold, and more like a place built to erase people from the world. The commander dismounted slowly. He studied the prisoners as if counting them, measuring them. Then he gave a quiet order. The soldiers began dragging the nuns toward a staircase descending into the earth. A dark stairway carved into stone. Torchlight flickered along the walls. Each step downward carried them deeper into shadow. The air grew colder. Damp. Heavy. Finally the staircase ended at a long underground corridor. Rows of iron doors lined the walls. Cells. The soldiers opened them one by one. The sound of rusted hinges echoed like screams. Prisoners were thrown inside. Stone floors. No windows. Only a small hole in the wall where faint air drifted through. Sister Katerina fell hard against the ground as the chain was removed. The door slammed shut behind her. Darkness swallowed the room. For a long moment she could hear nothing but breathing. Then slowly whispers began rising from the darkness. Other nuns. Huddled against the cold walls. Some were crying. Some praying. Some too exhausted to move. Days passed. Or perhaps weeks. Time became impossible to measure. Food arrived once each day. A small bowl pushed through the door. Water that tasted of rust. The prisoners spoke rarely. They saved their strength. But eventually the soldiers began calling names. One by one. A door would open. Chains would return. And a prisoner would be taken upstairs. Interrogations had begun. The questions were always the same. Will you abandon your faith? Will you accept the empire? Will you convert? Those who agreed were removed from the cells. Taken somewhere else. No one knew where. Those who refused returned hours later. Bruised. Silent. Some could barely walk, but they still whispered prayers in the darkness. One night the guards came for Sister Magdalena. She stood slowly as chains were locked around her wrists. Before leaving the cell, she turned toward Katerina. Her voice was calm, almost peaceful. "Remember who you are," she said quietly. Then she disappeared into the corridor. Hours passed. The cell waited in silence. Finally, the door opened again. Magdalena was pushed back inside. But something had changed. She did not speak. She did not pray. She simply sat against the wall staring into the darkness. Katerina moved closer. "Magdalena," she whispered. No answer. Only silence. Then Katerina noticed something that froze her blood. Magdalena's hair had been cut. Roughly. Violently. The long braid she had worn for years was gone. The symbol of her devotion. Destroyed. Her hands trembled as she lifted them slowly. In the faint light leaking beneath the door, Katerina saw the marks. Burns. Cuts. And something else. The small wooden cross Magdalena had worn around her neck for decades was missing. Magdalena finally whispered a single sentence. So quiet it barely existed. "They are trying to erase us." The words hung in the cold air like smoke. Around them the other prisoners listened in silence. Because deep within that fortress, the goal was no longer simply punishment. The goal was something far darker. To strip away names, faith, identity. To turn prisoners into something else entirely. And for the women inside those underground cells, the worst part of their fate had not yet arrived. Time disappeared inside the fortress. Days blended into weeks. Weeks into months. The underground cells remained cold and silent. Only the sound of dripping water marked the passing hours. One by one prisoners were taken away. Sometimes they returned. Sometimes they did not. Those who came back carried the same hollow look in their eyes. A look that spoke of something deeper than pain. Something broken inside the soul. The interrogations never stopped. The same question returned again and again. Abandon your faith. Accept the empire. Live another life. Some prisoners finally surrendered. Exhaustion could crush even the strongest spirit. Those who agreed were taken away from the cells forever. No one knew where they went. But the guards never brought them back. Others refused. Even when their bodies trembled. Even when their voices weakened. Among those who refused was Sister Katerina. She was no longer the frightened girl who had stood at the monastery window. The months inside the fortress had changed her. Her face had grown thin. Her hands carried scars from iron chains. But something inside her had hardened. The guards noticed. One evening her name echoed through the corridor. Katerina! The iron door opened. Chains closed around her wrists once again. The corridor seemed darker than ever. Torchlight flickered along the stone walls. She was taken up the same staircase others had climbed before. Step by step toward the unknown. At the top waited a chamber lit by a single torch. The Ottoman commander stood beside a wooden table. He had watched many prisoners pass through this room. Most eventually broke. He studied Katerina quietly. "You are young," he said calmly. "You can still choose another life." His words were not angry. They were almost patient. But Katerina remained silent. The commander stepped closer. "Your sisters have already accepted their fate," he continued. "You do not need to suffer." For a moment the room was completely still. Then Katerina finally spoke. Her voice was quiet, but steady. My life was given to God long before I came here. The commander's eyes narrowed slightly. He had heard similar words before. Faith could be powerful, but pain was often stronger. Still, something in Katerina's voice made him pause. He studied her for a long moment. Then he slowly turned away. A short order left his lips. The guard stepped forward. But something unexpected happened. Instead of taking her deeper into the fortress, they led her back down the staircase, back to the underground cells. The door slammed shut behind her once again. The other prisoners gathered around her. What happened? One whispered. Katerina looked at the stone walls surrounding them. Walls carved by centuries of prisoners. Only now she noticed something she had never seen before. Marks. Thousands of them. Scratched into the stone. Tiny crosses. Names. Fragments of prayers. Some were old. So old the stone had begun to wear them away. Generations of forgotten prisoners had left their voices here. A message carved into the darkness. Katerina slowly reached toward the wall. With a broken piece of stone she carved her own small cross beside the others. A simple mark, but a powerful one. Soon the other nuns began doing the same. The wall slowly filled with new prayers. Whispers of faith carved into cold rock. Years later the fortress would change hands. Empires would rise and fall again. And when soldiers finally opened the underground cells, they found only a few survivors. Thin. Silent. But still breathing. One soldier asked a surviving nun what had happened inside those walls. She did not answer. Instead she pointed to the stone. Every inch of it was covered with carved prayers. Thousands of voices speaking from the past. The soldier ran his hand across the cold wall. And in that moment he understood something haunting. The fortress had tried to erase them. To destroy their faith. To turn them into nothing. But the women had left something behind that could not be erased. Their prayers. Their names. Their defiance. Even in the deepest darkness their faith had survived. And long after the fortress fell into ruin, travelers passing the cliffs above the sea sometimes claimed they could hear something strange in the night wind. Not screams. Not chains. But the faint echo of whispered prayers. Still rising from the stone beneath their feet. The wars of empires fade with time. Battles end. Kings disappear. Flags change. But some stories refuse to die. Hidden beneath ruined walls and forgotten fortresses there are still echoes of the people who suffered there. The nuns of St. Theodora were meant to vanish into silence. Their names erased. Their faith broken. Their lives forgotten by history. Yet the stone remembered. Every prayer carved into those walls became a voice that time could not silence. A reminder that even in the darkest prisons the human spirit can leave a mark stronger than iron chains. History often remembers the conquerors. But sometimes, the quietest voices leave the deepest scars on the past. And somewhere beneath those cold fortress stones, the whispers of those prayers may still remain, waiting for someone to remember them. If this story moved you, subscribe for more forgotten stories from the darkest corners of history. Because the past is never truly silent. It is only waiting to be heard.